Let's address a popular critique of utilitarianism: its complexity. Utilitarian calculations require one to take into consideration a very large number of variables, and to evaluate unknown quantities that are very hard to estimate properly. Measuring happiness is also not straightforward, and one needs to give thought to the randomness of a whole space of the possible foreseeable outcomes. Not exactly a simple task. Maybe utilitarianism is purely too complex to be of any real use. To begin our discussion, we should acknowledge that utilitarian calculations can be complicated, and that they can be hard to get right. For instance, many of the calculations we have seen on this channel rely on estimating the utility produced by a societal rule. But how does one actually calculate how much utility a societal rule is worth? We know that there are cases where rough utilitarian calculations appear to tell us that societal rules can be broken. For example, one can concoct up improbable but realistic scenarios where an innocent person could unknowingly be about to trigger a disaster that would kill billions of people, and that the only way to stop him would be for a sniper to shoot him in the leg. Rough utilitarian calculations would tell us that eroding the rule to not shoot innocent people would be worth it in this case, since otherwise an incredibly large amount of suffering would occur. But how do we rigorously know that the negative utility produced by the rule erosion component is smaller in magnitude than the utility of saving most of humanity? Theoretically, we can rigorously define the utility a rule is worth by stating that it is worth all the happiness and potential happiness the rule produces. Then the rule erosion component would be a fraction of the utility a rule is worth. In the case we are considering, if we assume human life to have positive utility, and that in such an exceptional circumstance the probability to erode the rule would be minimal, then the rule erosion component would quite straightforwardly be less than the happiness and potential happiness all of humanity would maintain by avoiding such a disaster. Notice that we are still using some amount of guesswork, because we don't have the exact quantities under consideration. In principle, we could try to estimate them empirically, but sometimes, like we have just done, we can reasonably infer the answer the utilitarian theory would give to the conundrum it's facing. So yes, a rigorous implementation of utilitarianism is intricate and it involves estimates, but this does not mean we should abandon the framework. Let's give some arguments in defense of utilitarianism from this type of criticism. Firstly, with efforts and perseverance, humanity has achieved amazing things, and has developed some pretty intricate theoretical frameworks for physical phenomenons. The amazing models and frameworks we have produced can be very complex, and not yet rigorously formalized entirely. This does not stop scientists from working on them and utilizing them effectively. As we argue, it should not stop moral philosophers. Moreover, since the first formalizations of a utilitarian theory, improvements in the fields of statistics and positive psychology have helped make progress in estimating happiness. And we have also increased our computational power immensely. Such feats would have probably seemed impossible to many of our predecessors, and they certainly relocate extensive utilitarian calculations closer to our reach. Indeed, with the use of our modern tools, the utilitarian calculus is easier than ever to perform. Certainly, there is still a long way to go, but if we keep on making progress, we should not exclude that what today seems overly complex may not become routine in the future. Second argument in defense of the complexity of utilitarianism. It's okay, as we have touched on elsewhere, to not take on the difficulty of performing utilitarian calculations all by yourself. Society can aid by having experts work on common cases to produce general rules. This outsources some of the complications and gives one a general picture, a common sense morality of what tends to increase overall happiness. Thus, although the rigorous calculations can be complex, It is not really that hard to have a broad idea on how to produce positive utility. In many cases, the utilitarian answer can actually be quite straightforward. If one makes people around him suffer for selfish reasons, it's quite easy to deduce that according to the utilitarian theory, his actions aren't moral. We are used to seeing complex calculations because in the philosophical realm, we are often dealing with edge case scenarios that aim to test the theory. An applied implementation of a utilitarian theory in our day-to-day lives is not always as complicated. Lastly, and this is the main counterpoint we wish to stress, utilitarianism is complex because morality can be complex, and a moral theory has to enclose that complexity. Take an example where there are three people drowning. Two are in their 60s and they are drowning close together. The other is a teenager. You know that if you go to save the two that are close together, you can probably save them both, but the teenager would die. On the other hand, if you save the teenager, the other two would probably drown. Who do you save first? The answer to this question does not appear straightforward to justify. If one is not convinced, he can tweak the setting to reach a desired level of complexity. Maybe there are two teenagers and three men. Maybe they all have the same age. Maybe there is a cute puppy drowning with a teenager. The scenario can be constructed to put an arbitrarily difficult choice in front of you. The point is that there's plenty of these types of cases where it's not straightforward to decide what ought to be done. What a moral theory should be capable of doing is to provide an answer, at least in theory, to any of these complicated questions. It is then only natural that a model that manages to generalize to any of these complex cases will be itself quite involved when dealing with them. Performing the, morally speaking, best action in these cases could require some forethought. And that's fine. Nowhere is it written that being good should be effortless. It's not like it's always easy to say what is better or more moral in certain situations, and utilitarianism reflects this intricacy. Here we believe that this should be considered a feature of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism manages to capture the complexity of morality. It's quite remarkable. In essence, we are skeptical of the possibility of simple theories when dealing with the ethical domain. Indeed, many other modern moral theories don't do a better job in being succinct and simple when determining what is good. And that is to be expected.